When people ask me why I chose this place, I always hesitate before answering. How can I explain that Curieuse Island chose me just as much as I chose it? 3 years ago, when I first set foot on the damp sand of this island in Seychelles, I felt something I had never experienced in decades of academic studies and scientific expeditions. A visceral sense of belonging, as if every cell in my body recognized this place as home. I remember that first day with a clarity that time has failed to blur. The unmistakable scent of the mangrove, a mix of salt, decaying plant matter, and life. The aerial roots of the mangroves emerging from the water looked like ancient fingers trying to tell stories that only those who know how to listen can hear. I stood frozen for almost an hour, just observing the rhythm of the tides embracing those roots, while rare birds, many still barely catalogued by formal science, danced in the branches above. My academic background in marine biology, crowned with a PhD that cost me 7 years of seclusion in Parisian laboratories, had not prepared me for the emotional impact of this encounter. Academia had provided me with analytical tools, rigorous methodologies, and respectable credentials. But it was here, in this small forgotten fragment of paradise, that I finally found the purpose I had long sought in high-impact scientific journals. I fled Paris as one flees a prison. My last relationship had crumbled under the weight of my absences, of my obsession with work. "You talk more to your algae than to me," Isabel told me on the last night we spent together. I couldn't argue. My advisor was pressing for more publications, the university demanded more teaching hours, and my colleagues were competing for increasingly scarce funding with a ferocity that repelled me. When I received the invitation to coordinate a research project in Seychelles, I didn't think twice. In the first few weeks, I set up my research station in an abandoned hut by the beach. It was a modest space, a bedroom, a small kitchen, and an area that I adapted into an improvised laboratory. The sun and salt-faded wooden walls told stories of previous researchers who, like me, sought refuge on this island. Carvings, markings, faded notes in French and English, small ghosts of past discoveries that now kept me company. I named my small boat Cousteau, perhaps an all-too-obvious tribute to the explorer who fueled my childhood dreams. It was a simple vessel, with an outboard motor and just enough space for my collection equipment and at most 2 passengers. But it was all I needed to navigate the mangrove inlets and nearby reefs. In the first few weeks, I meticulously mapped every section of the lagoon, creating a mental grid of the territory that was now my open-air laboratory. My routine soon settled in with surprising ease. I always wake before sunrise when the world still belongs to the birds and the small crabs that leave geometric patterns in the sand. I prepare strong coffee in a rusty kettle I found in the hut, an object I now consider a lucky talisman, and head out for the first observation of the day while sipping the bitter liquid. This moment, between night and day, reveals ecosystem secrets that remain hidden at other times. By 6 in the morning, I'm already aboard Cousteau, silently navigating the mangrove channels. I always carry my waterproof notebook, binoculars, sample collection equipment, and a GPS that meticulously marks each observation point. I dedicate my mornings to counting and monitoring the migratory birds that use the island as a resting point. It's fascinating how some species, after thousands of kilometers of flight, find this tiny point in the Indian Ocean with precision, returning year after year to the same branch, the same nest. At noon, when the sun makes fieldwork nearly unbearable, I return to the hut to analyze the collected samples, organize data, and take detailed notes. My workspace faces a window that perfectly frames the lagoon, like a living painting in constant transformation. Sometimes, I lose myself watching the ballet of the waves instead of analyzing the data before me, a distraction I would never have allowed in Paris, but one that here seems an essential part of the scientific process. The afternoon is dedicated to collecting water samples from different points in the lagoon and monitoring physical chemical parameters. Temperature, salinity, pH, turbidity. These numbers tell stories about the ecosystem's health. Over the past 3 years, I have built a robust database that has revealed seasonal patterns and long-term trends. It is meticulous work that requires patience, but it gives me an intimacy with this place that few humans will ever experience. The evening usually finds me at the highest point of the island, a small promontory from which I can watch the sun sinking into the horizon while making my last notes of the day. Nights are for data analysis and communication with the outside world, when the precarious satellite internet system cooperates. I send monthly reports to the university and local environmental authorities, maintain a scientific blog that few read, and occasionally participate in video conferences with colleagues in Paris, London, or Washington. These connections to the academic world remind me of the life I left behind, a life that now seems to belong to someone else. When the night's work is done, I usually sit on the small porch of the hut, listening to the sea as the stars draw celestial maps of unparalleled clarity. The silence here is not an absence of sound, but a living presence, a sonic fabric of small natural noises that form a subtle symphony. The rustling of leaves, the movement of the water, the occasional call of a night bird, the rhythmic breathing of the ocean. In this voluntary isolation, I have discovered a peace I never knew in the noisy streets of Paris or the competitive halls of academia. Here, there is no need for social performances, professional masks, or institutional political games. There is only the raw honesty of nature and my equally honest response to it. My occasional assistants, usually masters or PhD students who spend a few weeks or months here, often comment on my transformation. "You seem like a different person," Sophie told me on her first visit. "Lighter, more alive." She was right. In the 3 years I have dedicated to mapping the mangrove ecosystem, I have cataloged dozens of species that depend on this delicate balance. Each one has become familiar to me, like old friends whose habits and idiosyncrasies I know intimately. I know when the fiddler crabs will perform their mating dance, when the herons arrive for their morning fishing, when the sea turtles will come to lay their eggs on the beach. This knowledge is not just scientific, it is visceral, built day by day through patient and respectful observation. In my most honest moments, I admit that this island saved me. It saved me from the bitter academic I was becoming, from the man incapable of lasting relationships, from the scientist who had lost the ability to marvel. Here, I rediscovered the wonder that first led me to biology, the deep admiration for the intricate web of life, the insatiable curiosity about how everything connects in patterns of interdependence and resilience. Thursday morning began like any other. The ritual was always the same: strong coffee at sunrise, notebook prepared, equipment meticulously checked. I stepped onto the cousteau with the familiarity of someone performing a well-rehearsed dance. The boat swayed gently under my weight as I positioned my collection kit and adjusted my life vest, which, after so many years, bore stains of salt and sun. My plan was simple: observe the migratory birds that had arrived overnight and collect water samples from 3 strategic points in the mangrove. The sky was particularly clear that morning, an intense blue so vivid it almost hurt the eyes. The lagoon's water mirrored that blue in tranquil ripples. Nothing suggested that this day would be any different from the 194 days I had spent in this paradise. Nothing indicated that it would mark an irrevocable rupture in my peaceful existence. It was approximately 9:47. I remember precisely because I had just noted the time in my journal when I heard the first sounds. At first, I mistook them for the engine of a local fishing boat, though it was uncommon to see them in that specific area. But soon, I realized the noise was different, louder, more invasive. The roar of powerful engines tore through the morning soundscape like a sharp blade. From my observation post in the mangrove, I raised my binoculars and scanned the horizon until I found the source. What I saw made my stomach sink. A yacht of obscene proportions was advancing toward the lagoon, a monstrous mass of white and chrome reflecting the sun. It was easily 40 meters long, far too large to navigate such shallow and, more importantly, ecologically sensitive waters. By the flags fluttering proudly, I identified it as Italian registered. As the vessel approached, I could make out figures on the deck, tanned bodies in tiny swimsuits, glasses raised in endless toasts, the carefree posture of those oblivious to, or indifferent to, the impact of their presence. A steady beat of electronic music pulsed through the air, reverberating against the reefs. disrupting the delicate sonic equilibrium of the ecosystem. Immediately, I reached for my radio to contact the authorities on the main island. This wasn't just an annoyance. It was a violation. The yacht was entering a designated environmental protection zone, where vessels of that size were strictly prohibited. The propellers of that marine behemoth could devastate coral formations that had taken centuries to grow, stir up sediments that suffocate marine life, and stress already endangered species. But before I could complete the call, I noticed something strange in the water. At first, it could have been mistaken for a drifting bed of algae or an unusual underwater current. An abnormal ripple, like a disturbance from deep below the surface. Something I had never observed in 3 years of meticulous study of these waters. I lowered my binoculars, unable to believe what I was seeing with the naked eye. A dark silhouette moved beneath the crystal-clear lagoon, with a motion pattern that didn't match any species cataloged in this ecosystem. Larger than an orca, and orcas didn't even inhabit this region, but moving like a giant eel. What made the sight even more unsettling was the speed and determination with which it was heading toward the yacht. The tourists, completely unaware of the danger approaching, continued their wild celebration. The music grew louder. Laughter echoed over the water. Champagne spilled over the yacht's polished edges. I estimated around 25 people on board, a considerable group for a yacht of that size, even though it was spacious. I tried shouting, waving frantically, but it was useless. I was too far away, and the party's noise drowned out any attempt at a warning. I grabbed my radio again, this time to broadcast an emergency warning on all channels, but it was too late. The impact came with terrifying violence. There was no warning, just a blur of underwater movement followed by a thunderous crash that seemed to shake the very air. The yacht lurched violently to starboard as if it had struck a hidden reef, but I knew there were no reefs in that specific location. Bottles and glasses slid across the deck, shattering. People screamed, some thrown into the water by the impact. The electronic music continued for a few more surreal seconds, an eerie soundtrack to the chaos unfolding. A second strike, even more powerful than the first, hit the vessel from below, almost at its center. I watched in horror as the hull was briefly lifted out of the water before crashing down with a thunderous splash. At that moment, brief yet terrible, I caught my first real glimpse of it. Gray-green scales glistened under the relentless sun. A serrated back, reminiscent of a crocodile's but at monstrous proportions. That's what it seemed like. The creature must have measured at least 15 meters, maybe more. A fragment of its tail whipped the surface before vanishing again, creating a wave that rocked my observation post violently. There was no time for scientific analysis, no mental cataloging of characteristics or comparison with known species. My body reacted before my mind could fully process what I had seen. I abandoned my equipment, sprinted along the wooden walkway through the mangrove, leaped onto the Cousteau, and started the engine with trembling hands. As I sped toward the chaos, part of me, the rational trained scientist, questioned the wisdom of this impulse. What could I possibly do against a creature of that size? How could my small boat provide effective help? But another part, more primal and fundamentally human, knew there was no choice. People were in danger. Some were already struggling in the water. As I approached, the situation proved even more desperate than it had seemed from a distance. The yacht was tilting fast, its bow lifted at an absurd angle that defied the laws of buoyancy. The water around it had turned red in several places. Bodies thrashed, some visibly injured, others clung to floating debris. Fragments of what had once been luxurious furniture, now turned into makeshift lifeboards. The creature had momentarily vanished, but the water churned with deep, unsettling movement, as if something massive was circling just below the surface, evaluating its next move. "Here! Over here!" I shouted, positioning my boat near a group of survivors. 3 women and 2 men, all in designer swimwear now stained with blood. Their faces bore expressions of pure, primal terror that made my throat tighten. I reached out, pulling them up one by one into the Cousteau. Their trembling hands clung desperately to the boat's edge, perfectly manicured nails now broken and bloodied from their fight for survival. The boat dipped dangerously low in the water with the added weight. What was that? What was that? One of the women kept repeating in Italian, her body shaking violently as a deep gash in her leg dripped a mix of seawater and blood onto the deck. Another man remained silent, staring blankly ahead, his pupils dilated in shock. "Stay low and hold on," I commanded in English, then tried in broken Italian, forcing my voice to sound steady as my eyes kept scanning the water's surface for the predator. More people were still in the water, screaming for help, maybe 10 or 12 scattered within a 50-meter radius. I took the first group to the nearest shore, helped them disembark, and immediately turned back to rescue more survivors. With each trip, it felt as if I were gambling our lives against time. On the third and final trip, as I neared an older man, who I later learned was the yacht's captain, the creature surfaced partially, less than 20 meters away. This was no fleeting glimpse. It was clear enough to sear itself into my memory like a brand. A primitive skull, something between reptile and fish, with bony ridges resembling the fossils of Cretaceous-era predators I had studied in my academic career. Eyes, deep, black, lateral, holding the darkness of prehistoric oceans, devoid of emotion, but filled with an ancient predatory intelligence. Its jaws opened briefly, revealing rows of triangular teeth that could easily crush my small boat. The captain screamed something in Italian, a sound of pure terror. I reached out, gripping his arm as the creature submerged again. For a moment, our eyes met, his disbelieving, mine trying to convey a confidence I did not feel. With one last effort, I pulled him aboard and immediately gunned the motor, zigzagging erratically to throw off any pursuit. We reached the research base in what felt like hours, but were only minutes. My small team, 3 research assistants who had arrived the previous week, stared in shock at the bloodied, traumatized survivors I had brought with me. We quickly turned our limited space into an improvised emergency center. As we dressed wounds, distributed painkillers, and cleaned injuries, I set up an emergency call with the main island's Coast Guard. The connection was weak, crackling with static, but I managed to convey the urgency of the situation. When I finally finished counting the survivors and cross-referencing information, the outcome was bleak. 22 people rescued, most with various injuries, and 7 missing, presumably dead, either devoured or drowned during the attack. The yacht had sunk completely, leaving only floating debris and a slick of oil slowly expanding across the lagoon's crystalline surface. Another environmental tragedy layered upon human horror. One of the tourists, a middle-aged man with a deep gash on his arm, approached me as I wrapped up the communication. "You saved our lives," he said in hesitant English. "What was that thing?" My team of researchers stared at me with a mix of terror and disbelief, waiting for a scientific explanation, for some rationalization that might lessen the horror of what they had witnessed from a distance. "What do you think it is, Maxine?" Sophie asked as she applied makeshift bandages to an Italian tourist who was groaning softly. I looked at the faces around me, traumatized survivors, fellow scientists, people who relied on my expertise to make sense of the incomprehensible. "Something that shouldn't be here," I finally replied, avoiding details that would only fuel the panic. "Something that has remained hidden for a very long time." The answer was deliberately vague, but it contained a truth that I was only beginning to process myself. We had just encountered something that defied our current understanding of the natural world. A ghost of evolution. A visitor from a past we thought we only knew through fossils and museum reconstructions. That night, as we waited for rescue, the silence in the research station was oppressive. The survivors, exhausted from the trauma, had fallen asleep on makeshift mattresses in the lab and common room. Only I remained awake, sitting at the analysis table, frantically reviewing my research files under the dim glow of a lamp. I flipped through page after page of notes from the past few months, searching for clues that might have foretold what had happened. As if somewhere in my meticulous records, there was a note, an outlier I should have noticed, a warning I had ignored. And then I found it. Over the past 3 months, we had recorded anomalies in deep water temperature readings around the island. Unexplained increases in specific zones, mainly east of the lagoon. At the time, I attributed them to equipment failures or temporary climate phenomena. And there was more. Reports from local fishermen about massive shadows moving beneath their boats, accounts I had dismissed as exaggerations or the typical superstitions of traditional maritime communities. One fisherman in particular, old Maurice, had come to me twice, insisting he had seen something huge in the northern bay. Guilt consumed me as I connected the dots. The climate changes we had documented over the years were affecting more than just surface temperatures. They were altering deep ocean currents, destabilizing unexplored underwater caves, creating new channels between the abyss and the surface. We had unknowingly awakened things that time and evolution had consigned to the shadows. When the rescue helicopter finally arrived at dawn, bringing doctors, coast guards, and government officials, I was immediately surrounded and questioned. Under the unforgiving morning light that highlighted our exhausted faces, I spoke in deliberately vague terms about what had happened. Possibly a predator displaced from its natural habitat due to shifting marine patterns. Maybe a large shark confused by sound interference. I did not mention what I had truly seen. I did not speak of the serrated dorsal ridge, the predatory intelligence no known shark possessed. Nor did I mention that I had seen something similar, albeit briefly, among the mangrove roots 2 weeks prior. At the time, it had been just a fleeting impression. A dark shape, far too large to be any known local species, moving among the aerial roots before vanishing beneath the surface. I had dismissed it as a trick of the light, a combination of shadows and reflections on the murky water. The survivors were evacuated in 2 helicopter trips. Some hugged me before leaving, tears mixing with the dried salt on their faces. Others remained in a catatonic state, staring into nothingness, unable to process what they had experienced. The yacht captain, a man whose sun-scorched face looked as if he had aged 10 years in a single morning, gripped my hand tightly before boarding. After the last helicopter departed, the area was temporarily declared a biological hazard zone, a convenient excuse to keep tourists and onlookers away while a preliminary investigation was conducted. My assistants began packing their belongings that same day. Sophie was the last to decide to leave. "You should come with us, Maxime," she said as she zipped up her backpack. "At least until we understand what really happened." "I need to stay," I replied, unable to fully explain why, even to myself. It was a half-truth. Yes, 3 years of meticulous research could not simply be abandoned. But there was something else, something I could not yet articulate, a fascination, a calling I had felt since my first glimpse of that creature. Something about its presence spoke to me in a way I could not rationally explain. In the days that followed, I delved into a new kind of research. I examined historical records of the islands, accounts of unexplained shipwrecks, and local legends about sea monsters. I compared the fragmented glimpses I had of the creature with paleontological records. The resemblance to certain prehistoric marine reptiles was undeniable. A mosasaur-like being that should have been extinct for millions of years. But there were differences too, adaptations suggesting continuous evolution in the unexplored depths of the ocean. The idea of a relic population, surviving in isolated underwater caves, evolving separately from the known marine world. It was both scientifically revolutionary and utterly terrifying. As my investigations progressed, my sleep became fragmented, haunted by nightmares in which I swam through dark waters, feeling something immense circling below. I would wake up drenched in cold sweat, only to find the cabin empty and silent, except for the constant sound of the sea, which now carried an ominous undertone I had never noticed before. And now I find myself at a crossroads. I should have left after this. Most of my assistants are gone. The survivors have been evacuated to hospitals on the main island. The area has been temporarily declared off-limits to tourists, and I don't know if I can stay here, knowing that thing is still in the depths of the ocean, waiting for its next meal.